Hello and welcome. Think of this place as the archives of unintended consequences. My name's Barnaby Finch, and I'm the keeper here. My whole job is to look after the oops moments in history. You know, those single forgotten sentences that ended up accidentally reshaping our entire world. And today, we're going on a tour to see how our world was really built on mistakes.
You know, we always think of history being written by these grand figures, right? Conquerors with swords, brilliant politicians. But what if I told you that's not the whole story? The big idea we're digging into today is that history is often shaped by something way more ordinary. A tiny legal oversight, a phrase that wasn't thought through, and the incredibly clever people who find a way to drive a freight train of social change right through that little gap.
All right, let's start our tour. We're going to head down the first wing of the archives, and we're going to look at three things that seem to have nothing in common: windows, whiskey, and divorce, and see how a tiny little loophole in the law for each one created these massive, totally unexpected waves across society.
Okay, first up, 17th century England. King William's government was broke. I mean, really broke, thanks to some very expensive wars, and they needed a new tax, one that people couldn't easily dodge. Now, taxing what people earned was seen as, a bit rude, too invasive, so they came up with what they thought was a brilliant idea. Tax something everyone can see. And what's the most obvious sign of a big, fancy house? Lots of windows.
And here it is, the fatal clause, the mistake. You see, the law set up different tax brackets, a basic fee for everyone, but a much higher tax if your house had more than 10 windows. The lawmakers probably patted themselves on the back, so clever, but they completely forgot a basic rule of human nature. If you tax something, people will find a way to have less of it.
So what happened? Well, the backlash was immediate, and you can literally still see it today. People started breaking up their windows just to duck under that 10-window limit. Go look at old Georgian buildings in England. You'll see these blind windows everywhere. But it got much darker than just changing how buildings looked. With less sunlight and fresh air, diseases like typhus and cholera just exploded. Rickets, which is caused by a lack of vitamin D from the sun, got so bad it became known as the English disease. Even the phrase daylight robbery comes from this. People were literally complaining that the government was stealing their sunlight.
But here's the crazy part, the incredible twist in this story. The absolute misery this tax caused actually started a revolution. For 150 years, doctors and reformers fought back, arguing that sunlight and clean air were essential for life. And eventually, they won. The tax was repealed. And that victory brought in this totally new, radical idea that a government is actually responsible for the health of its people. The entire concept of public health was born from a tax on windows.
All right, let's jump across the pond and forward in time to our next exhibit. It's the 1920s in the United States. Prohibition is in full swing. America is, on paper at least, a completely dry nation. The saloons are shut down, the breweries are locked up, and yet people are still drinking. So how? Well, the answer was buried in a tiny little exception in the Volstead Act. The people who wrote the law, they threw in a clause allowing doctors to prescribe medicinal liquor. They were probably picturing, an old woman getting a teaspoon of brandy for her cough. What they did not imagine was that basically the entire country would suddenly come down with a wide range of illnesses that could only be cured by a pint of whiskey, prescribed by a doctor, of course.
And this one little loophole, it didn't just let people drink. It completely changed the face of America. Before this, drugstores were kind of small, dusty places. Suddenly, they were gold mines. A pharmacist named Charles Walgreen realized that, hey, if people are coming in for their prescription, why not sell them a soda or a magazine or some aspirin while they're here? And boom, the modern American convenience store was born. At the same time, it moved drinking out of the public men-only saloons and into private homes, giving birth to the cocktail party and completely changing how men and women socialized.
Our next story takes us out to the desert. It's 1931, and in most of America, getting a divorce is nearly impossible. It's slow, it's expensive, it's humiliating. You often had to literally prove your spouse cheated on you. Meanwhile, the state of Nevada was on the verge of collapse. The Silver Rush was over, the Great Depression was in full swing, and the state was desperate for cash. So they started looking for a solution in their law books.
And this is where they came up with an absolute masterstroke. See, most states said you had to live there for at least a year to be considered a resident and use their courts. Nevada? They looked at that rule and just slashed it, all the way down to 6 weeks. All of a sudden, anyone in America with the money for a train ticket could go to Reno, hang out on a ranch for a month and a half, and get a quick, clean, no questions asked divorce.
This one little trick created the Reno divorce industry, which absolutely exploded overnight and basically bankrolled the creation of a little gambling town nearby you might have heard of, Las Vegas. But the real impact was so much bigger. It turned divorce from this moral failing into a simple consumer product. It showed just how out of touch the laws were everywhere else and started a domino effect that eventually led to the no-fault divorce revolution across the entire country.
Okay, I need to pause here for a moment. The next exhibit we're coming to in our archive is a tough one. The tone is going to shift because we've been looking at quirks and innovations, but what we're about to see is how a loophole can be twisted from a clever workaround into a truly powerful weapon of oppression.
This is the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the law that abolished slavery. It should have been a period, a full stop on a horrific chapter. But look closer. Look at those 13 words right there in the middle, except as a punishment for crime. That was the loophole. That was the crack in the foundation that allowed the entire nightmare to be rebuilt under a new name.
Southern states, desperate to get their free labor force back, exploited this clause with horrifying efficiency. It was a horrifyingly simple three-step system. First, they just invented new, ridiculous crimes like vagrancy or loitering to arrest newly freed black men. Then a judge would slap them with a huge fine they had no way of paying. And finally, to work off this new debt, the state would lease that prisoner, that convict, right back to private companies, often to the very same plantations where they had just been enslaved. It was slavery by another name, all made perfectly legal by 13 words.
So that tragic example shows the devastating power these things can have. Now let's zoom out, because these kinds of oversights haven't just created social quirks. They've redrawn the map of the entire world and even redefined what it means to be human.
I want you to think about this question. It was a real legal question in Canada in 1927. Are women persons? See, a trailblazer named Emily Murphy was the first female judge in the British Empire, but her rulings were constantly being challenged, and the argument against her was based on a loophole of omission. The law, written back in 1867, said only qualified persons could hold office, and for 60 years, everyone just assumed persons meant, well, men. So she and 4 other amazing activists, the famous 5, decided to force the issue and took it to court.
And the result was absolutely stunning. The Supreme Court of Canada looked at the law, looked at the history, and said, no. They actually ruled that in the context of that specific law, women were not legally persons. It was a shocking moment that made it clear how the law itself had made half the population invisible. But they didn't give up. They appealed their case all the way to the highest court in the empire, in London. And in 1929, that court dramatically overturned the ruling. The Lord Chancellor famously said that to exclude women was a relic of days more barbarous than ours, and that the law shouldn't be frozen in time, but should be seen as a living tree, something that can grow and change. That one decision didn't just open up politics to women, it legally recognized their personhood, unlocking doors all across the British Commonwealth. And for our last one, it's not about a legal sentence, it's about a line on a map, a huge, world-changing miscalculation. Back in 1494, Spain and Portugal were about to go to war over the New World. So the Pope stepped in. He took a map, drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic and said, okay, everything west of this line is for Spain, everything east is for Portugal. The only problem, their maps were wildly incomplete. They had no idea that the eastern coast of South America bulged out so much that it actually crossed over his line. That bulge is Brazil. That is the only reason why 200 million people in the Americas speak Portuguese today. A single map-making error.
And that brings us to the end of our tour. We've seen how these little gaps, these accidental backdoors in the law, have had just monumental, world-changing consequences. So let's head back to the archivist's desk and put this all together.
So you see the pattern, right? A tax designed to get money from the rich ends up creating public health. A law meant to stop people from drinking gives us the modern convenience store. A cynical ploy for money in Nevada ends up redefining marriage for everyone. A horrific exception in a document of freedom is used to re-enslave thousands, and a simple overlooked word is used to legally redefine half of all people. What this all really shows us is that law is this rigid grid that we try to place over the beautiful, fluid chaos of human life, and it never, ever fits perfectly. These loopholes, they aren't failures of the system, they are the system. They're the breathing holes, the pressure release valves, where society, when it gets squeezed by rules,
finds a way to break out and become something totally new.
And that's the real takeaway here. The biggest changes don't always come from big grand plans. They come from the little details, from the letter of the law, not the spirit. Which, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What forgotten clause in a user agreement, what unwritten rule of the internet, or what digital loophole is quietly shaping our world right now? What's the next gap in the fence that we're all about to walk through?
Please like and subscribe.